Stephen Simon, as you may know, is currently an adjunct senior fellow of Middle Eastern Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, and he's the former senior director of transnational threats at the National Security Council. Stephen will be moderating. I think we're just getting him back into the room now. Just a program note.
I wish I were
silverware. So if you could do me the favor of between now and when the servers come out, if you just clear the tables and the papers a little bit and clear the aisleways, that'll help make this a little bit faster transition for us. And we're just waiting for Mr. Simon. And here it is. Thank you, Stephen, for joining us. Stephen, in your absence, I did a quick introduction of you. So, thank you.
This is going to be a great session because we've got two great speakers. We've got Kenneth Balin, the president of A Terror-Free Tomorrow, who has been dealing with these issues both in and out of government for many years. In government, in the executive branch, and in Congress, and at the sharp end of the stick as a prosecutor. He'll have not only experience, but a great deal of research to bring to bear on our discussion. Greg Johnson is, for all intents and purposes, a Yemeni. He has a personal project, which is, by the end of his career, to have actually spoken to every single person living in Yemen. And I would say he's really very nearly there after a Fulbright in his recent research. And this is crucial because most of us, first of all, never encounter Yemenis. Secondly, Yemen is a major source of concern to the U.S. and other governments on the terrorism front. And thirdly, because the U.S. as a government, and I think this is true for some of our allies as well, doesn't have access to the kinds of people that Greg Johnson routinely speaks to. He also is the, I don't know what the right word is, the author, the webmaster. He's the originator of one of, I think, the three top blogs on Middle Eastern society and politics today, Waka Wak. You should consult it. I don't know what channel it's on, but anyway, it's really great. I'm going to turn the floor over first to Kenneth Balin, and then we'll turn to Greg Johnson. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. I want to thank Peter Bergen and the New America Foundation, as well as Karen Greenberg and NYU for putting on this program today. I'm going to try to be very brief and make 3 points in 10 minutes. I'm sorry I don't see General Stone here because I want to strongly disagree with him. I'll get to that in a minute. 3 points. Number one, the Saudi program that you heard Dr. Hadlock describe is very commendable. Number two, it's way too early to tell whether it's successful on its own terms. But number three, the most important message that we can take from that program is that it's being done and what it represents about Saudi society at large. The first point is the program is certainly commendable. It's comprehensive, professional, and systematic. I spent over a month in Saudi Arabia, interviewed some 100 people, both participants in the program as well as officials running it. No doubt that they're, as you saw from Dr. Hadlock's presentation, doing a first-rate job. What's really important about it is that they're doing it at all, and what that says. That people from the program are on the news media. I saw many participants on it, myself watching just Saudi TV. They're in the mosques, they're in the schools, and this is a ripple effect throughout society. Now, Peter Bergen asked me to comment briefly on Indonesia and the program that they have for de-radicalization in Indonesia, the world's largest Muslim country. They don't have a program. That's my comment. What they have is police helping individual people on an ad hoc basis transition away from radicalism, so they help them do prosecutions. That's not a program like they have in Saudi Arabia. I talked to one of my Indonesian colleagues, in fact, yesterday, and they said they're trying to put together a program, and they could greatly use your help. There's their plug. But they don't have a program. Okay, second point. Moving quickly. While the program in Saudi Arabia is commendable, while the efforts of General Stone in Iraq are commendable, question, are they really something new? Has this ever been done before? How about in the United States of America? Well, as Stephen alluded to, I used to be a federal prosecutor. I put nearly 100 people through a program called the Federal Witness Protection Program. We've had this program in the United States for some 40 years. 20,000 people have gone through the Witness Protection Program. We give them new identity, new lives, vocational training, jobs, and a lot of money, a lot more money than the Saudis, by the way. That's a criticism of the Saudi program. They give these people money after they go through it. Well, it pales in comparison to the money the U.S. government spends on people. So that's kind of a red herring criticism, if ever there was one. Anyway, we have this wonderful program where we do this in the United States. So what's the result? Let's step back here for a minute. Let's talk about, we get these people, we have success, we change their minds. What's the recidivism rate? Well, first of all, for the Saudi program, they haven't been doing it long enough. GAO did a study of Saudi counterterrorism efforts, and they said it, I don't have to. Experts need a longer period of time to assess recidivism than they've had in the program. But it doesn't matter really what the reported recidivism rate is. It matters who's going out and who's coming in. Anyone here know what the recidivism rate in the United States is for people released from prison? Well, this is an educated audience. 66, it's actually 67, 2/3. That means within 3 years of being released from U.S. prison, 3 years, 2/3 are back. How about from the Witness Protection Program, where we spend a fortune on these people, where we give them a whole new life and a whole new location, training, false papers. Many of us in this room would welcome that opportunity. And you know what the disincentive is for going back? You know what? When you're in that program, you usually have to pay a price, which is to testify against someone in organized crime, or a violent gang, or a Colombian cartel case. You know, and if you go back to your former life, if you reoffend, you know what happens to you? You get shot. You get killed. That's the disincentive for returning. But yet, how many people return in that context? Well, many leave the program and disappear off the radar screen, yet the Department of Justice reports that 17% actually go back to their former life of crime. Most of them end up killed. So if we can't stop them from going back in that context, imagine the difficulty. General Stone talked about a committed hardcore radical or terrorist versus someone who's not. Well, that's the whole point, isn't it? Because if someone's not, we know in the U.S. prison system, there is one group of prisoners who we can rehabilitate very successfully, and do. Who are they? You knew my last answer. You don't know? It's those who's not hardened criminals to begin with. They do quite well with rehabilitation programs. So when you look at the Saudi population, or you look at what's happening in Iraq, you have to distinguish between people who are violent, extremists, terrorists, and people who have some kind of vague sympathy, or people who've been swept up by some other fashion into the movement. And right now in Saudi Arabia, as Dennis Blair Director of National Intelligence, testified before the Senate Intelligence Committee. Most of the people being released in this program are for relatively minor offenses. So we don't really know whether they're not recommitting acts of violence, because first of all, they never did it to begin with. Secondly, do they fear confinement? Is that what's deterring them, or have they actually been changed in their mind? This is a wonderful program. What we've done in Iraq is a good program as well, as General Stone pointed out. What we've done at Guantanamo is exactly the opposite of what we should be doing. But nobody in this room should be under any illusion that somehow we can take a hardcore Al-Qaeda guy, put him through some program, and he's going to come out singing Kumbaya. It's just not going to happen. And while everything that's being done is exactly right and positive and it's commendable, we have to recognize the limits of it. Because we've been doing it for a long time in the United States with almost no success. And, you know, somebody who commits acts of terror and violence is by nature a criminal. They may have a different mindset, but they are committing criminal acts. Now, the most important point, I think, about the program is that it reflects part of a larger effort inside Saudi Arabia that's addressing extremism. It occurs within a sea change in public opinion inside Saudi Arabia. I directed perhaps the only comprehensive independent public opinion poll of Saudi opinion among ordinary people. And even people who express some kind of sympathy towards Al-Qaeda or bin Laden or whatever are adamantly opposed to terrorism. And this has been a huge sea change since before 2003, 2004, as Dr. Haddock pointed out. So within a society that's rejecting this and that's supporting the government's efforts to go after extremism, you can have some success. But there's a huge gap between taking someone who's already a committed radical and trying to change their point of view and preventing someone from becoming that in the first place. And this is what's most important about the Saudi program, is that they are going into the schools, that they have public media campaign, that they have religious leaders, including religious leaders who once supported Al-Qaeda, are now being put forward and educating and being part of a new system. And this is very, very important inside Saudi Arabia. This is where the Saudi influence on the rest of the world, because it is the land of the two holy places, can exert a great influence. Because when you go to the rest, when you go to Pakistan, you go to Indonesia, and you conduct polls as we have, you find that the country that's most admired is Saudi Arabia. So there's a lot that can be done. But it is a lot easier and a lot more productive to try to prevent someone from going down the radical path than trying to change their mind once they're there. And indeed, the more committed they are, the more down the path they go, the harder it is to reverse course. So to wrap up, these kind of de-radicalization programs in prison environment are absolutely essential, but they're not sufficient. More important is what's occurring in the society at large. Ultimately, more successful will be preventative efforts. But we do owe the Saudis a great deal of thanks, because right now, for Al-Qaeda, the poster boys that they want to get front and center are Guantanamo detainees, ex-Guantanamo people. So that every time on Saudi television, somebody who went through the Saudi program gets up and denounces Al-Qaeda, that despite the fact that we put them through 7 years in Guantanamo, that is a great victory against Al-Qaeda. Unfortunately, some of them will go to Al-Qaeda again. They were committed extremists, and they're not going to change, or they became radicalized inside Guantanamo. But the message, while Al-Qaeda seeks these people who have been through Guantanamo, the anti-Al-Qaeda forces also seek them, so that every person who has gone through the program inside Saudi Arabia and stands up against Al-Qaeda publicly on Saudi TV, in the mosques, in the schools, inside Saudi Arabia, broadcast to the rest of the world, that is a defeat for Al-Qaeda. Thank you.
Thanks for that great presentation. I'd like to echo the speakers before me and publicly thank both the New America Foundation and the NYU Center on Law and Security for inviting me to speak here today. I've been tasked with talking about Yemen's experiment with de-radicalization, and I'm going to stick rather closely to this brief. In order to get at it today, I thought it'd be helpful to divide my talk into three parts. The first part is going to give you an overview of Yemen's rehabilitation program from its inception in September 2002 until its closure in December 2005. The second part provides an analysis of why I believe the program ultimately failed. And finally, in the third part, I'm going to talk briefly about what this means for us today, particularly with regards to the problems posed by the Yemeni detainees in Guantanamo. But before we get to the multitude of current problems, I think it'd be instructive to look at the history of Yemen's program. So following the attack on the USS Cole in 2000, and particularly after the September 11 attacks, Yemen went out of its way to demonstrate its support for the war against al-Qaeda. Yemen was worried that its dubious history of dealings with jihadis made it a legitimate target after Afghanistan. In order to avoid this perceived fate, Yemen made sure that the U.S. knew that it was on its side in what was then called the war against terror. During the November 2001 visit to Washington, President Saleh publicly offered his support to President Bush. When he returned home to Yemen, motivated by fear and worried that if he did not take serious and significant steps, someone else would, the Yemeni government began arresting anyone it suspected of harboring sympathies for al-Qaeda. Men who had spent time in Afghanistan, particularly those that returned to Yemen in the weeks surrounding the attacks, were obvious targets. But the dragnet quickly expanded to include young men deemed to be security threats in governorates across the country. For the Yemeni government, this soon evolved into a strategy: corral as many people as possible in the hopes that the U.S. would not attack. It was simple, it was brutal, and it was not at all sustainable. But at least in the short term, it did exactly what it was designed to. It prevented an American attack. Within months, Yemen's jails were full of hundreds of suspects, many of whom the government had little, if any, evidence against. Facing potential unrest at home from tribesmen who were seeing their sons and brothers arrested at an unprecedented clip, and dealing with an unbending U.S. abroad, President Saleh began to look for a way out. In late August and early September of 2002, he convened 2 meetings over the course of 3 days with 30 clerics to consider various ideas for establishing a council that would re-educate suspected militants. This was the compromise, the president believed, that would satisfy both his domestic constituents and his international allies. It would allow him to release the prisoners that were such an irritant at home, while not appearing to be soft on terrorism to the U.S. The only problem was that none of the jurists were willing to endorse his idea, claiming that the program, and by extension they, would be labeled American or Zionist agents. Only one judge, Hamoud al-Hittar, agreed to Saleh's proposal. The process from conception to implementation moved fairly quickly, and by November 2002, al-Hittar recommended that 36 prisoners be released as a test group. Each was given his freedom, with the caveat that they be kept under tight surveillance by Yemeni security services, although this soon proved to be more rhetoric than reality, as Yemen lacked the resources and infrastructure to keep tabs on so many former prisoners. A little over a year later, in December of 2003, al-Hittar selected another 92 converted militants for release, claiming that the first group had honored their pledge to give up violence and extremism. Over the next 2 years, al-Hittar would release 236 more prisoners, bringing the total number to 364 by December 2005. The beginnings of this program coincided with 2 separate trends, both of which contributed to its early successes. First was the destruction of al-Qaeda in Yemen's infrastructure through targeted strikes and arrests, and the second was the war in Iraq, which attracted more Yemeni fighters than a dying jihad at home. Both of these, more than al-Hittar's program, helped to explain the almost complete lack of terrorist attacks in Yemen in 2004 and 2005. This was brought home on December 10, 2005, when Khalid al-Hamadi, who writes for Al-Quds al-Arabi, wrote an article suggesting that 2 graduates of al-Hittar's program had made their way to Iraq and carried out a suicide attack on U.S. forces there. The news came at a particularly bad time for al-Hittar, who was actually in Washington at the time promoting his program. Not only was he embarrassed abroad, but in Yemen, the news was used by local detractors in the Ministry of the Interior to shut down his program. Since then, there's been a great deal of talk about restarting the program as a way to rehabilitate or re-educate the Yemenis currently in Guantanamo. But despite President Saleh's recent revelation that Yemen had a deal with the Bush administration to repatriate the Yemenis to participate in such a program, nothing has happened. Now that I've given you an overview of both the Yemeni context and the program itself, I think it would be helpful to delve a bit deeper into the details of its failure. The Yemeni program, just like its successor, the Saudi program that we heard a bit about earlier today, is based on the premise that the state can convince these individuals that their understanding of Islam is incorrect and has been perverted by charlatans. But when many of the detainees view the state itself as the enemy, convincing them of the error of their ways is a gargantuan task. The clerics, brought in to re-educate the detainees on the principles of Islam, lack legitimate authority in the eyes of many prisoners, who view them as paid agents of the state, willing to say and legitimize whatever the state wants. This, the militants maintain, is not Islam, but rather a corrupted and distorted version whose sole purpose is to ensure that the state, whether it be the Al Saud family or President Saleh, remain in power. The Yemeni program also suffered from a lack of funds and al-Hittar's inability to act as a strong advocate for his graduates. One supposedly rehabilitated militant who was granted his release through al-Hittar's program, his name's Hamza al-Dayani. He's currently on the run from Yemeni security forces who want to arrest him yet again. Gave an interview to a local news outlet, Modern Press, explaining his reasons for not abiding by his agreement with the state. His return to jihad, he stated, was based on the fact that the government did not deliver on any of the promises it made him when he was released. Instead of easing his transition back into society, he was harassed out of his apartment by security services, robbed by soldiers at checkpoint, while the request to help an ill brother was ignored. When he complained to al-Hittar, he received a little help, as al-Hittar lacks access to the levers of power that would allow him to dole out state favors to his graduates. Saudi Arabia's economic standing should allow it to more easily deter those who can be bought off with jobs and promises. But the Saudi program is essentially one of bureaucratizing bribery. Those individuals that want to return to the battlefield, as numerous cases like Saeed Ali al-Shihri and others demonstrate, are not going to be swayed by time in a rehabilitation program. Instead, they will simply bide their time and, when released, return to jihad. This, as al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula has recently made clear, is deception and not betrayal, and deception is allowed in war. Originally, it appeared that al-Hittar's program had been successful in getting the released prisoners to agree to what I've often termed a tacit non-aggression pact. The militants were given their freedom in exchange for agreeing not to carry out attacks in Yemen. Changing their ideology, according to many of the former prisoners that I've spoken with, was not part of the deal. This delicate arrangement appeared to be working for a while, but more recent events have shown al-Hittar's program to be a failure on a more fundamental level. 3 of the suicide attackers who carried out the September 2008 assault on the U.S. Embassy in Sana'a were reportedly graduates of al-Hittar's program. In the few minutes that remain to me today, let me conclude with a couple of thoughts about what the failure of al-Hittar's program means for the future of the Yemenis in Guantanamo, many of whom are prisoners of their citizenship, since they can't be released as the U.S. does not trust the Yemeni government. Certainly there's a place for these rehabilitation programs, but it's important to remember that they are only a small, tiny part of the solution. Focusing on them to the exclusion of all other options is an invitation for failure. I don't think there are any easy or obvious answers, but we should be aware of the dangers of the idea that rehabilitation is a way out of Guantanamo. These rehab programs provide the same sense of false security as padlocking a tent. They have little impact, but they give U.S. policymakers the confidence to return detainees, at least so far, to Saudi Arabia. demanding, funding, and rebuilding a similar program in Yemen may ease the collective conscience of U.S. officials, but it will do little towards actually solving the problem. Nor will sending Yemenis to the Saudis program. Those who don't want to fight won't, and those who do will. Their time in rehab will do nothing to alter either. It's a waste of time, money, and effort, and it's not even the best of the bad ideas. It's just a bad idea. It simultaneously convinces the U.S. that it's actively working to solve the problem, while doing nothing other than passing the buck of responsibility to other countries and washing U.S. hands of any responsibility. The U.S. may derive some immediate comfort from this, but the long-term cost of pursuing short-term benefits will be exceedingly high. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We've got some time for Q&A for the panel. As a whole, I'd just like to lead off with two questions. Very brief. One is for Kenneth Balin. It's my impression, which might not be up to date, that radicalization as a broad phenomenon in Indonesia is on the downswing. If that's true, why? And are there any lessons for Europe, Indonesia, Europe, Yemen, or Saudi Arabia? And for Greg, what do you recommend if sending the Yemenis to Saudi Arabia is not a satisfactory answer? Keeping them in the United States is clearly not satisfactory, and the Yemenis themselves have a problem keeping people in custody, at least historically. What do you think is the best way out, recognizing that there are no good solutions, and you're quite right about that?
Certainly, I guess I'll go first. Right, I don't think there are any good or easy solutions. The Yemenis that remain, you have various estimates, and most people I think are putting it around 94, 97. They really run the gamut, and people who, I don't have access to classified material, so I can only read what's in the public domain, but certainly there are obvious cases, or at least cases that stand out to me, of Yemenis who are quite clearly innocent, and there are also Yemenis that, to me, raise a number of red flags. So separating these out and finding how to separate these Yemenis and what to do with them is an incredibly difficult problem that's only been made, in my opinion, much more complex by the 8 years of Guantanamo. But the way that the U.S. has handled it in refusing to sort of send any of them back, even the ones that seem clearly to be innocent, like it has in Saudi Arabia or Afghanistan, has, I think, only exacerbated the problem.
On Indonesia, it takes a longer answer than I can give because there have been a lot of societal changes in Indonesia with a more successful government, more democracy, economic growth. There's a lot happening in the Indonesian society which accounts for the lessening of radicalism. However, there's a huge caveat to that. First of all, it has nothing to do with rehabilitation efforts, that there's less terrorist attacks now in Indonesia. Secondly, there is some very good police work going on. And third, there's some societal changes, such as the rejection of violence. However, there's a long history of radicalism inside Indonesia going back half a century, and it's not going to go away, and it's taking different forms, and it's an ever-present and ongoing threat. So while it subsided temporarily, or for now, that doesn't mean it's off the radar.
Thanks. We'll open it up to questions for Gregory Johnson and Kenneth Balin. Please give your name when you're called on, sir. Microphone? There should be a floating microphone.
Thanks. I'd like to have both speakers comment. One of the criticisms that I've heard, Jeff Steinberg, one of the criticisms that I've heard of the Saudi program is that while it clearly targets the terrorist aspect, and the theological underpinnings may in some cases present more of a tactical difference than a fundamental difference in strategic outlook. And I wonder whether or not, in the case of the Saudi program, if it also applies to Indonesia, Yemen, and others, whether or not we're sort of potentially putting too much of a stake in this and laying the ground for potentially larger future problems involving the general spread of radical Wahhabism, while sort of accepting the idea that it's bad for terrorists to target the United States at this time or to target the Saudi monarchy. Yeah. What do you think?
Well, you know, personally, I agree. I don't know whether I see Dr. Heidlock there. I personally happen to agree with him, and I'm not sure what's meant by radical Wahhabism, because I'm not sure that's the source of the problem. You know, I think that part of the Saudi effort is engaging people in religious dialogue, and I think to the degree that they can bring in people who have radical credentials, street cred, so to speak. And there are some inside Saudi Arabia who were supporters of al-Qaeda who are now speaking against al-Qaeda. That goes a long way toward convincing young people that this is not a sustainable path.
Right, I think that's very a good question, and I would add, when it comes to the Yemeni context, to be quite blunt, Hamoud al-Hattar, someone like him, just doesn't have the intellectual weight and the popular following to really make a difference with the people that he's talking about. Right now, al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which has its roots in a February 2006 prison break from Yemen, they have constructed a narrative that is broadly popular within Yemen. There's a reason that al-Hattar was the only cleric who agreed to President Saleh's proposal, and there's a reason that Iraq wasn't a topic of the conversations. Going to fight in Iraq, going to fight in Afghanistan is something that's broadly popular within Yemen, and currently there's a great deal of apathy towards al-Qaeda in Yemen. And what you have is al-Qaeda constructing a message that's broadly popular because it meets with what many popular clerics are saying. They're not coming out and giving support directly to al-Qaeda, but they're saying similar things.
My name is Samar Chatterjee from Safe Foundation. Would like to address a comment and a question. Major General Douglas...
How about just a question?
Well, I've got to give you a background of the question. So he said marginalization of the violent groups by empowering the moderates. I do think there is a need in this country too to do that, because our right wing is extremely violent, particularly those who supported Bush-Cheney administration. Is there not need for a training to have the same kind of thing that the Saudis are doing, to train them not to be advocating for wars one after the other, which is really causing terrorism in this country?
Okay, next question. In the back there, on the left. It may take a half an hour for the mic to get to you.
Thank you all. Thanks to the speakers. This is specifically directed to Mr. Bailey. Thank you very much for your presentation and giving a healthy dose of skepticism for the earlier presentations regarding de-radicalization. My question, I guess, is that from my perspective, I think it's very difficult, given some of the obstacles that you mentioned before regarding de-radicalization. Do you think that perhaps, given that there should be, first of all, better emphasis on prevention as opposed to cure, using a medical analogy, that if there's any sort of cure, so to speak, that it really shouldn't focus on de-radicalization, but more so on disengagement, in terms of making sure that the individuals just focus on not re-engaging in criminal activity, as opposed to focusing on the ideology behind it, per se, that might be a more feasible thing, perhaps, even given the...
Okay, so the behavior versus belief pattern.
Yeah. Yes and no, as Greg pointed out. I mean, if you limit it to simply disengagement and say, well, they're not going to go to Iraq or whatever, or they are going to go to Iraq and not fight here in Yemen or Saudi Arabia, your victory might be Pyrrhic and not long-lasting. So I think you have to deal with the core of the belief, and that's why it becomes more difficult the more deeply one believes.
Anybody else decide on
Yeah, my name is Brock Clark. The first degree you said about Al-Qaeda's popularity, I have to disagree with you about the populace. I was in Yemen when the Marrakesh bombing in June 2007. It was widely condemned by the people on the street. And then the president went on television the next day to say that the bomber was in Yemen. He did that because it was widespread disgrace. And he spoke to Mohammed al-Kurdi, you probably know, he said suicide bombers to Iraq. He said it's okay to attack foreigners outside the country, but not in the country. About the Dialogue Council. Qatar stressed, based on I don't know what happened to the Saudis, but based with the Yemenis that I spoke to, Qatar stresses the coercive as opposed to the pedagogical element. Qatar stresses the coercive as opposed to the pedagogical element, threatening long prison sentences for those who don't agree to his terms. I was hoping you could address the differences between the approaches that Qatar is taking with Al-Qaeda and the Houthis. He's spoken at length about this, saying that he had an almost 100% success rate with Al-Qaeda. Of course, we know it's not true. But he said he's encountered a lot of difficulties with the Houthis because they adhere to a literal meaning of the text. I was hoping you could address that.
Yeah, thanks. First on the popularity, certainly it takes a much greater political and theological leap to carry out a suicide attack within Yemen. And this is something that isn't supported, but I think most people are apathetic given everything else that's going on within the country. What I meant by popularity is that most of Yemenis support the broad goals that Al-Qaeda is espousing, with the exception of suicide attacks. But again, not a whole lot is said, with the exception of maybe something for a day or two right after a Marib attack in 2007. But my comments are based on the trip that I just took in August and speaking to a variety of different people around the country. On your second point with the difference between Al-Qaeda individuals that went through the program and the al-Houthi followers, a lot of this, Al-Qatar, as he explained it to me, said, Al-Qaeda follows the text and the al-Houthi people follow a man. But a lot of this has to do with sort of internal Yemeni politics and what's going on as far as the regime targeting the Houthis, which of course there's been the sixth war that's been going on since August. When I spoke to Al-Qatar about a month ago, in his new position, he's been well rewarded for his public stance. He's now the Minister of Religious Endowments. He talked about a 50% success rate, meaning that the program was a success. So he certainly backed down, but he,
Okay, one more question. I see that Philip Mudd has started to eat, so we really want to get him up here. Right, now timing is everything. Sir.
Scott Bonner, I'm a director at Georgetown. I recently returned from Singapore to their program, and you talked about one of the issues being that the government is trying to do rehabilitation. In Singapore, it seems it's a little bit different as a volunteer organization throughout each mosque. And do you think that approach would have any influence?
Kenneth?
To the degree that you bring in, I'm not sure that for a committed radical, whether it's a non-governmental agency that they probably view as an arm of the government anyway, is going to make much of a difference ultimately. To the extent you could bring in people who've been through, were once radical or once believed in it, yes, as I mentioned earlier, it will have more credibility with people. But again, it's a continuum. The more committed you are, the less swayed you're going to be. And that's just the way it's going to. You're going to have more success with people on the margins than with the more committed folks. That's the reality of the situation. Whether you're talking about Pakistan or the Taliban or Afghanistan, or you're talking about Saudi Arabia, Yemen, or Indonesia or Singapore.
I'd like to thank our panel for a seriously downbeat presentation. Bon appetit.